As we approach this topic, let us be clear-eyed and clear-minded. War is violent, horrific, and inflicts human suffering. Technological advances for discrimination and precision to limit suffering have also moved with industrialisation of warfare at scale. Some actors have deliberately eschewed technology to widen indiscriminate violence to maximise its impact. Such actors are frequently labelled as terrorists. The 7th of October attack on Israel was terrorism delivered by a terrorist organisation, Hamas. Israel's inevitable and justifiable response has resulted in even more significant devastation, loss of life, and human suffering. We're not here to divide and argue from ideological corners. We can hold two thoughts in our minds simultaneously as we seek to learn as military professionals. Remembering the purpose here is to identify what the Australian Army can learn. We must take these observations and generalise them. Our culture, geography, demographics and history are different. However, there are a great many lessons to further our own understanding. Good evening and welcome to the 2nd Division's last Tuesday of the month PME. I'm your host, Christopher Millhouse. Today's topic is a reflection on defence of one's homeland to identify what the Australian Army can learn from the 7th of October attack by Hamas and Israel's response. Our presenter is Dr. Levi West. He has read widely in this area, having researched and published on terrorism, counterterrorism, and the strategic logic where terror intersects with communication and technology. As usual, some quick notes before we start. This is part of the CoveTalk series recorded on the 25th of June 2024. All information is deliberately presented at the unclass level. The views presented are those of the individual representing them and not the official positions of the Australian Army, the Department of Defence or the Australian Government. Lastly, thanks to the program partners, the Cove, the Australian Army Research Centre and the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess. Please subscribe to the Cove's social media for more PME presentations. Thank you, Dr. West.
Thanks, Christopher. Hi, thanks Christopher and thanks Jeremy and thanks to Tudiv. It's a pleasure to be back here. I've been here a few times previously in various guises. So what I want to try and do this afternoon in the half an hour that I've got, give or take, is unpack and hopefully get to some of the things that maybe the ADF can learn about what's gone horrifically bad in regards to both October 7 itself, but in particular the Israeli response. Some of that is going to be a little bit of a stretch because the circumstances are fundamentally different. That's probably the first big point that I need to make. Right? The attack on October 7th, which was undertaken by Hamas. Hamas is a proxy of Iran. Iran has invested in Hamas and Hezbollah for something akin to 30 plus years. And that even if I was to draw a very, very bad off-a-cliff deterioration of our regional geopolitical circumstances, our adversaries, competitors in this part of the world have not invested in violent organisations the way that the Iranians have. So a scenario even remotely close to what happened on October 7th, happening to Australia or even to Australian interests in the region, is highly unlikely. That's a reasonable assessment. Right? There is just simply not an actor in the region with the kind of training, capability, both in terms of the sponsor, but particularly in terms of the terrorist actor. So a direct replication, coupled with the fact that for the most part, over the course of the past 20 odd years of the war on terror, Australian terrorists in country have been of fairly low calibre, is the polite way that I would frame that. We are not overrun by highly capable terrorists in Australia. So the scenario itself is unlikely. But what I want to do is sort of run through the attack itself really briefly and what makes it novel. The bulk of my research as an academic is about how it is that terrorism is able, when it's calibrated correctly, to achieve disproportionate strategic effect. And I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that the geopolitical reverberations of October the 7th are strategic at the very least, if not grandly geopolitical, and if not recalibrating a whole range of factors well beyond just the region. They will impact the presidential election in November. They will likely impact somewhat the election in the UK that's coming up. They'll certainly impact the elections in France. They've changed the dynamics of the Middle East. When you get terrorism properly calibrated and do it well, if I can put it that way, it can have amazing reverberations well beyond just the tactical operation that you're undertaking. So by unpacking the operation itself a little bit, we can get our heads around why it worked. Then I want to talk a little bit about why, or the bits of the Israeli failures that also contributed to the success of the attack itself. And then I want to pull it back around and try and tease out some of the strategic implications of the attack, and then bring it back around to the Australian bits, at least to the extent that I can. So the main reason that the attacks on October 7th, or Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, which is what many parts of the world refer to it as, because there is a narrative that's not ours about this. The main kind of novelty of the attack, aside from its scale, which is mostly unprecedented, you can sort of got to look at something like Mumbai as about the closest kind of proximate attack with the same kind of complexity and scale, but even then not really close, is that it was ultimately a multi-domain terrorist attack. People entered Israel at about 30 different points along the fence, the southern fence of Gaza. Those of you who've been to Israel will know how small the country actually is and how much you feel that. So that if someone breaches the southern border, that is an enormously consequential thing all the way through the country. And it's also a very tight-knit country woven together by compulsory military service. That means that when something happens like that, the phone tree runs pretty hard and fast. But about 30 different points of penetration along the southern fence into Gaza. Small breaches by sea, about 4 dinghies with a handful of frogmen that came into a beach community. Air attacks, so rockets from the southern border out of Gaza is a fairly regular occurrence. But in addition to that, about 30 powered paragliders and a litany of drones. In alignment with all of that, a proper cyber campaign and a proper information campaign that meant that at 6:30 a.m. on October the 7th, there was a radio address from senior leadership of Hamas. There was a television address shortly after the operation started, well before Netanyahu's office was even aware of the scale of what was happening. So an entirely calibrated and coordinated, sophisticated, multi-domain terrorist attack, something well and truly above even the most sophisticated kinds of terrorist attacks that we've seen previously. That, combined with the enormous numbers of casualties that they were able to inflict in the south of Israel, plus the fact that they were able to stream significant components. So most of you, whether you follow this stuff specifically in a professional capacity or just watch the news, probably saw the footage of the girl on the bike that got broadcast all over television news. That's terrorism doing what it does best, right, which is producing content for the news. But they did that kind of stuff across the board, which meant that the impacts beyond the 1,200 or so that died and those that got kidnapped reverberated in enormous ways. In terms of Israel's shortcomings, they were regrettably significant, and they were both in the sort of operational sense but also in the political sense. So some of you may have seen some of the reporting that talked about the fact that there were what was left in the south in terms of intelligence capability monitoring Gaza before the attack had watched dry runs and training runs of the very operation that took place on October 7th. But when that document about that plan had gone through the intelligence community in Israel, it was dismissed that Hamas was never going to be capable or something like that. It's the kind of thing that Hezbollah does. And so when those reports went back through to Central Command, they were dismissed as like, no, of course not. There's some really unfortunate components to that, which is that it was predominantly female analysts that were sending those reports back to Central and were being dismissed, at least in part, because they were female analysts and collectors rather than there's a misogyny component to what happened in terms of the failures. There's also a significant political dynamic to that, which is that for Netanyahu to keep the coalition that he has within Israeli politics together, which includes 2 very, very, very far right politicians, both of whom, if you've watched the Four Corners episode, Forever War, former director of Shin Bet and former foreign minister refer to both of them as terrorists, 2 sitting members of the Knesset who formed the coalition with Netanyahu. To hold that coalition together, the current government of Israel has tolerated or encouraged a fairly substantial increase in settlements into the West Bank, and that's required moving resources from the south to protect settlement communities into the West Bank, which means that what was left on the southern perimeter of Israel was significantly diminished from what it would normally be. Folded in and on top of that is 2 big pieces that are a little bit harder to sort of evidence, but I think are reasonably deductive assessments. The first of those is that any national security and intelligence apparatus relies in part on a degree of myth. Right? And the Israeli intelligence apparatus in particular had an enormously excellent myth about Mossad and Shin Bet and its omnipotence as a capability, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but across the Middle East. The risk that comes with that is that you start to believe your own hype. And when you have got full spectrum surveillance on the entirety of Gaza, that's great. If you're relying primarily on SIGINT rather than HUMINT, you can start to think that you actually know what's going on in the heads of the people that you're surveilling, when in actual fact you just know what they're talking about on the phone. And so a significant part of what happened is a belief in their own sort of omnipotence that meant that they weren't doing the usual things that you would do to double check that you were actually getting the right kind of assessments out of your intelligence apparatus. In addition to that is a reasonable assessment that's essentially made up of something resembling fatigue. A desire to believe that Hamas just wanted to govern Gaza, because otherwise we have to keep going into Gaza and doing things like what's happening right now, right? And even significant chunks of the Israeli public, given the costs and consequences of having to go in on a rolling basis and how many losing people, the psychological and long-term impacts of that on a society as a whole, but on the individual soldiers that have to do it, it's not the kind of thing that any country really actually wants to be doing on the regular basis. So wanting desperately that Hamas does want to govern, and missing the fact that actually that's not what they're interested in at all. So there's a whole bundle of Israeli failures that then make the idea of it being a likely scenario here very, very difficult to tease out. Probably the thing that makes it more distinct from any other previous terrorist attack is the kind of, aside from its scale and its complexity, is just how effectively calibrated it was. So depending on how much attention you pay to broader Middle Eastern geopolitics, Israeli-Saudi normalization was running at speed. That didn't have nothing to do with the timing of the upcoming US presidential elections either, right? The idea was, at least in theory, that we wrap this up, Israeli-Saudi normalization, happy days, great talking points, Biden's foreign policy works really effectively in the Middle East. Right? From Iranian perspectives, that is a terrible, terrible outcome, in part because the Saudis would have wound up with F-35s as part of that arrangement. And once the Saudis had F-35s, that's the regional dynamics done, right? Air superiority across the Middle East, as well as a US, Israel, and Saudi triumvirate, completely alters the geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. And so by calibrating up an operation that in advance knew would provoke exactly the reaction that it's provoked, which is Israel going as harder than it has ever gone before into Gaza or into any parts of the occupied territories, and doing exactly what Iran and Hamas wanted them to do, which is to kill Palestinians. Because I reckon it lasted about a week where the world's sympathy sat with Israel. But then once once airstrikes started happening into Gaza and ground troops started pushing into Gaza and tanks started rolling into Gaza, that perception of Israel as the noble actor, as the good guy, inverted very quickly. Now that happened in part because there is a fundamental dilemma of a strong, powerful military fighting a weak, non-state actor. But the other one is that Hamas did a very good job of making sure that there was plenty of footage of rubble and of dead children and all of the things that come with a ground invasion of the most densely populated place on the planet. That meant that the news outlets involved had plenty of footage to run the story about it all, and it all shifted the narrative very, very, very quickly. What that then did was put Western governments in a fundamentally wedged position, right? Where either you unquestioningly endorsed the stuff that was happening on the TV, which looked terrible and awful, or you end up looking like you're kind of supporting or sympathising Hamas. And if you've watched any of the governments of the Western world try to navigate this particular problem set, it's not particularly edifying to watch any of them, right? No one has been like masterful in the way that they've managed to navigate this, because it's a wedge, it's a magnificent wedge. So aside from at least delaying significantly Saudi-US normalisation, it's then created a secondary problem, and this is where I think there's some really significant lessons about trying to understand and manage the politics of what falls out of this, which is, and probably the best way to understand this is to go back a little bit in history. So the Munich massacre happened in 1972, right? It was in 1974 that Yasser Arafat stood in front of the General Assembly by invitation and literally threatened them. If you watch the video on YouTube, he talks about, I come here not with my gun of freedom fighter, but with the olive branch of peace, and then proceeded to tell the General Assembly, don't make me drop the olive branch of peace. 2 years it took, right, between the Munich massacre being enough of a make the Palestinian issue front page news, put it into political discourse, for Arafat to address the General Assembly. The attacks happened on October 7. It took somewhere in the vicinity of 6 months before the General Assembly voted to make Palestine, endorse a motion to make Palestine a member state of the United Nations. Now that's not the same as being a member, but the General Assembly's politics is very different to, say, the Security Council. But in terms of strategic outcomes, in terms of getting the Palestinian issue on the front page, enormously successful. If we pull this back around now a little bit to sort of what we can try and take from it, probably the most significant thing to me, I am not good with maths, but I got my wife to do some rough numbers. So Israel's got a population of about 8 million people. They mobilised 300,000 people in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. All reservists, mind you, with 3 years of compulsory IDF service under their belt for the most part. For us to do the same, we would need 1 million people, give or take. We need 1 million reservists to do something on par, right? But we need 1 million people to do the same proportion of population mobilisation that Israel's done. And they did that for the best part of the first sort of 3 months or so of operational tempo, where they actually were using 300 reservists, until they started to see what the economic impacts of taking that proportion of your population out of the economy and having them fight a war started to do, which was that for the fourth quarter, their annualised GDP drop was 21.7%. Right? Is it all of a sudden, yep, we're doing this really, really well. We're doing this, I won't say really well because I can't, we were talking before. If someone can tell me what the strategic end state of this particular exercise is, I'm all ears and I'll happily work with you. I can write invoices for that, it'll be great. I can't, separate from the horror show that's happening, I can't even construct a defence of it from a strategic perspective. We cannot come even close to sustaining that sort of tempo over any type of time period. In addition, they've had their credit rating decrease dramatically, so they've gone from A++ to A-, both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Moody's directly cited ongoing conflict in Gaza as the reason for dropping their credit rating, which means that not only is there a massive drop in GDP, plus they're losing people, massive drop in GDP, coupled with then increased cost of borrowing for government. You throw into the mix of that the enormous shift, well, ongoing trend shift in sentiment broadly internationally towards Israel. In addition to the General Assembly motions, Spain, Ireland, which is unsurprising if anyone's been to Northern Ireland and seen the Palestinian flags that are almost more prevalent than Irish flags in certain parts of town, in Belfast. And Norway, I think, is the third country who have all recognised officially a Palestinian state. Probably the much more significant and I think problematic fallout from October 7 and the big lesson that we have to appreciate, and I'll use them as an example, is the university campus protests both here and in the United States, and the protests that happened in the immediate aftermath, where a terrorist organisation, unapologetically really a terrorist organisation, committed one of the most heinous terrorist attacks in history. And some 24 hours to 48 hours after that, people were proudly protesting, admittedly not in support of Hamas, but in support of the Palestinian cause. And there's a really problematic dynamic in the way that that's played out over time. In Canberra, one of the officials of the ANU's Student Association went on ABC radio and said that Hamas deserves our unquestioning support, right? Now, I'm confident that has a lot to do with the fact that that person didn't know anything about Hamas, Israel, Palestine, the Middle East prior to October 7, not because of a particularly informed perspective on it, but that's the point, right? What this has done, and it's the reason for the comments that Christopher made before and the reason for some of the comments that were in the blurb on the Cove site, is that this is a really great example of how in an already highly polarised political environment, this is the kind of conflict that sends everyone running to their corners. I can tell you what the talking points will be in The Australian tomorrow and on Sky News, and where they will sit without question. And I can tell you where they'll be if you read the Socialist Alternative or any of the proper hard left content. As a result, it's meant that politicians are desperately trying to navigate this horror show minefield where speaking about this particular set of circumstances requires trying to talk about it in a way that doesn't offend anybody, which is almost impossible, given that the entire thing is outrageously horrific and generally offends everyone just by mentioning the topic. The other part of those student protests, and I think the United States is the primary manifestation of this, is that to suggest, well, there are at least one or two Students for Palestine organisations of varying names that are reasonably well recognised as being explicit Iranian influence operations. Right? So going back to classic old school Soviet exercises of activist organisations infiltrating someone into that to amp things up and keep things moving. Because what it's now done on university campuses is drive further and further polarisation amongst the electorate, the impacts that that's likely to have. So if we assume for a certain period of time that there was a decent chance that either one of the very old and uninspiring men that might become the President of the United States is going to win, my assessment would be that the young Democrat voters that were significant parts of winning the election for Biden last time around will abandon the Democrat Party hard. They will bleed hard on their left flank because of this issue. One of the really fascinating and sort of minutiae examples of how this is all playing out is that here, I think, one of the universities in Sydney, as part of the negotiations to get the encampment protest off of campus, involve conceding a seat at the table as the university revises its defence investments to the people who were protesting, who know nothing about running universities, who know nothing about investment, but they're going to get a say. They get to be like, no, you can't invest in that one. And so you start to see this kind of multitude of ways in which it's impacted. But to me, I think the big lessons in this for the ADF, aside from some offensive ones that we can talk about once we're having a chat, is just what sustained mobilisation looks like and what it costs, and what that would actually mean for a country like Australia if we found ourselves in a scenario where we actually had to prosecute something. It wouldn't need to be huge, it would just need to be into a Pacific island or into PNG for a sustained period of time. The kinds of numbers of people that requires, beyond just conventional capability, is I don't think something that the government or the ADF is necessarily particularly well placed to sustain. And then the other part is the way that assuming, and I think the Israeli efforts at kind of IO and narrative management speak to this, assuming that we control how things are portrayed and how things are perceived is laughable and embarrassing. Assuming that we can just put out talking points and be like, right, so that's how everyone... No, it's not. It's really, really not. Right? It doesn't take a sophisticated actor in this day and age. It needs someone with a bunch of social media accounts and maybe a friend who knows how to set up sock puppets to run a really effective counter operation that completely shifts the way that the population of PNG or Fiji perceives what we're doing. Right? Assuming that we're just the good guys and everyone should understand that is a deeply problematic way for us to start to prosecute things. And then the last point that I'll make, because I think we're going to leave some time for questions, is that we probably should have been investing in a whole bunch of things about 10 or 15 years ago. But the scramble that's needed now, and I'm heartened by some of the developments that some friends of mine in defence are involved with, but understanding the centrality of how important a narrative is for undertaking military activity and how important that is for maintaining the kind of support that you need to maintain domestically so that everyone continues to back and support, and when it gets to the point of having to make actual sacrifices on behalf of that military effort, you need a somewhat cohesive capability at home. And if you're not across preemptively what that narrative is going to look like, and you're prosecuting that narrative and you've given it various forms and all of those sorts of things, then the ease with which an adversary just kind of comes along and goes bunk and pokes in a different narrative and it gets a bit of traction, especially if you're in an open society with a diverse population, is that you then have a secondary problem on your hands, which is that you're managing protests against the thing that you're doing, which the government's completely behind, but then they've got political considerations that they have to work into their calculus. and then it gets much more complex. So that's about, I think, as much as I can squeeze into half an hour. Otherwise, we'd be here for like a day, and the history of Hamas and Iranian foreign policy and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah.
So for Israel, this is an existential crisis which requires social cohesion and back it against Hamas. How do you see any lessons from how the Israeli population has papered over a lot of divisions within its own society that were bubbling along before this attack, to an existential crisis affecting Australia, noting the society's really changed, say, from World War II, where we last had an existential crisis? Do you see anything we can learn from what's gone on inside Israel in terms of how they've maintained social cohesion, noting that, you know, we've seen that social cohesion come under pressure for sympathisers of different points of view?
Yeah, awesome. So I think what happened in Israel is probably reasonably similar to what would happen in any context, right? So they did hold together. They were already very, very divided over judicial reform and all the other things that were going on within Israel. It's a very hard right-leaning government, and that is not reflective, certainly, of the Tel Aviv version of the Israeli population. For the first few months, they papered over it all very, very well. The crisis moment pulled everyone together, and everyone just got in and did what they needed to do. Everyone mobilised. The whole of the country almost entirely got behind the war effort. I think the thing that then becomes the variable is that once people started to be like, yeah, okay, but what are we doing here? What's the end state? We know that we can, you know, bomb Gaza till the cows come home, and we know that we've got capability that can go in and send 3 dudes through the door and get the one guy and all of those things. But what are we actually going to do here? And I think once that sort of, I think that we've got enough lessons out of wars like Vietnam, right, of where when the public starts to get cynical of the strategic calculus of those who are making decisions, that's when it starts to go back to the fractures that are there. And so I guess the first piece would be to not get involved in offensive activity that lacks strategic outcomes. That would be a useful start point. I don't think Western countries are particularly great at not getting involved in wars that don't have obvious strategic outcomes. And it's a fundamental dilemma when you're fighting an asymmetric actor, right? It's problematic. So I think it holds for a while, but it's fracturing now hard again in Israel. The war cabinet's already starting to fall apart, and it's not just the internals. The relationship between Israel and the United States has probably never been as tenuous as it is right now. The French are refusing to ship arms, right? It's not just the internals, they're losing friends too. And so I think there's two parts to that. One is maintaining internal social cohesion, but you don't fight wars alone. You need all of your allies to be on board as well. And if you make terrible strategic decisions, either because they genuinely don't want to support it, or because for domestic political reasons they have to be seen to not be supporting it, I think that's where you kind of wind up. So, you know, it's quite appropriate that wars are controversial in a liberal democracy, right? That they should be contested. I think what Israel has had, and probably it's fair to say, whether you like Netanyahu's politics or not, he has that strong leadership dynamic. Right? That means that he is going to push ahead with what he thinks is the right thing to do. And I think that as a characteristic of leadership can be a really powerful thing. The problem is that if where you're taking the country is over the edge of a cliff, there's not much room for anyone to be like, actually, I don't think that's the right direction. So yeah, I think it exposes the centrality and necessity of good political leadership to hold that together. Because you can. We've done it plenty of times before, right, in countries all over the Western world. But it does require a certain kind of character or characteristic of leadership that I'm not sure necessarily sits anywhere in the Western world. So.
We have a question from Major J, who's in Perth at the moment. Mm-hmm. Thank you for the presentation, very informative. Given the Israeli jus ad bello, or perceived right to war, in their mind is a perceived existential threat, is probably what drives their acceptance of mobilisation for service to the state. Yeah. Does this translate to other states also needing to be able to see an existential threat in their communities in order to be able to scale and mobilise security and emergency forces?
Yep.
Or is it possible to communicate preparedness and resilience for a just in case?
No, I'd go the former 1,000% and 10 times over.
Yeah.
That abstract articulation of threat by politicians, the commentariat, journalists and whatever it might be, is not a large-scale explosion or a boat in a harbour or dead bodies, right? If I draw some comparisons, and I've had this conversation with people in Canberra a lot, between the foreign interference and counter-espionage problem set versus the terrorism problem set. Terrorism, I say this in a context, is great, right? Politically, there's an explosion or a dead body. It's tangible and understandable, and the public responds and reacts. They understand what the problem is that you're trying to fix and solve and respond to. Foreign interference and espionage, it's invisible. There's no, how do I get the public to mobilise against offensive intelligence activity by a sophisticated nation state? It's just not the same. And without an overarching narrative of something like what the Cold War provided for that sort of stuff, and even then it was mostly done quietly, I think regrettably, in the absence of very, very clear, it's the reason why many countries engage in grey zone activities, is because it just gets to chip away quietly over time. And as a politician, I'm never given the opportunity to be like, see what they're doing? That's why you need to ration your fuel, because we need to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort, is because even though I think many of the adversaries of Western liberal democracy have been at war with us for some time, we still draw very, very traditional binary distinctions between war and peace and kinetic activity and things that aren't kinetic. And that's an enormous challenge. So yeah, I don't think you can mobilise properly in the absence of a crisis, unfortunately. Otherwise we would be. It's as simple as that, I think. So.
Okay, I have a question from online from Captain Nathaniel. Given that terrorism is inherently violent and that violence is promoted to communicate the terrorist message, what is our mirror reaction? How can the Australian Army use protection against violence or mitigation from violence to communicate our government's message and narrative? Is it done well by others that we should emulate? Should we do this, or is there something else we ought to be focusing on?
Yeah, okay. So I guess if I understand the question properly, that's probably something about sort of resilience and proactive measures. So if I understand the question right, if Israel is a case study, in this particular instance, is a case study of how not to respond to terrorism, right? There was a press conference early on where Netanyahu explicitly used the term vengeance to refer to it, which is exactly not what you're supposed to do, right? Calibrated, calculated, cold, strategic, patient responses is how you slowly, deliberately identify leadership members and not civilians, and you don't lose the narrative war. The inverse of that, to me, is the stuff that we do well when we get mobilised enough to do it in the Pacific, right? Which is building resilience into communities and into publics, often delivered by defence or by the federal police, but not as security agenda items, right? It's things that address climate change mitigation, it's building hospitals and doing all of that soft power kind of stuff that means that you don't need to use violence as your way of prosecuting an agenda, because you've got friends who 15 years ago, because you're actual friends, not now because someone else has shown up, you've actually got some loyalty built into that. Probably one of the, and this will sound far more glib than it should, one of the smartest things that I've seen in the last few years at least is genuine discussion about a Papua New Guinean rugby league team. I'm from Queensland, and that is a significant and intelligent decision from a whole range of perspectives. It gives you a vector for development and a whole range of other activities into PNG. It buys you a whole bundle of loyalty from a population who will then feel like a country that has a historical legacy with us. That kind of stuff is how you wind up not having to do what's happening in Gaza. Now that's difficult. Israel's circumstance is obviously incredibly unique in terms of their capacity to do soft power into Gaza is fairly constrained before October 7. But like that sort of stuff to me is how you preemptively and build, to quote a buddy of mine at Jock, latent influence, right? Is if you're doing that 10 years ago, you do it really well. There's people who are still alive who are like, oh, you know, I remember when the Australians came and did all that really great stuff, and my kids go to school now. It's not rocket science. But yeah, if I understand the question.
Yeah, ma'am.
Some of us, Dr. West, still play rugby league, says she who's got a Parramatta Eels cooler bag sitting next to the Chesterfield here. My question on your talk is around institutional hubris.
Yep.
And so you painted quite a sorry picture. It sort of went like this. Hubris leads to major intelligence fail, leads to major political overreaction and then kinetic overreach, leads to loss of the moral high ground and then massive economic opportunity costs. So my question, coming back to that original institutional hubris, what would be your advice to institutions like the ADF around how we can avoid drinking our Kool-Aid, our own Kool-Aid,
Yes.
especially as we come off such a long period of peace,
Yes.
where there's been absent existential threat, so to speak?
Yeah. So I think what it ultimately boils down to, and part of I think everyone's surprise at that scenario in Israel is that for a lot of people, certainly the ones that pay attention to Israeli national security, they were supposed to be really good at not doing that, right? Of having a sixth man in the room at all times who was the devil's advocate, who sat there and went like, no, I'm going to be the bad guy. I'm going to perpetually just annoyingly contest. They were supposed to be very, very good at that. There's some political pieces that sit over the top of that a lot, of appointing people as ministers for things that then trickles down into cultural shifts within organisations. But I think ultimately what that requires is culture. That's an organisational culture that's prepared to challenge and question and push back when something doesn't smell right, when something doesn't quite work the right way, whether that's strategic assessments or whether that's like, sir, with all due respect, I'm not sure that that's, because I think that this is what's going to happen and this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. And unless you build a culture that actively encourages that and people feel that that's the kind of thing that's going to be respected, well regarded, that they're not going to be punished for, that they're still going to get promoted, etc., then you're not creating the environments where people feel like they can exercise that. And that is a very, very, very fundamental challenge for a hierarchical organisation, which in a crisis just needs people to do what they're told, right? There's a reason for rank and all those sorts of things. So I think it's probably easiest within the intelligence end of the house for any organisation. But even then, it requires a sort of rolling cultural undertaking. And then in entirely transparent and self-interested ways. The other way to do it is literally external parties, right? If you get people in who aren't part of the institution and go like, right, here's what we reckon. And they go, well, actually, I've been studying PNG for the last 25 years and that's BS. Like, cool, but none of that's going to work, right? Completely external set of eyes that brings deep expertise, which is a difficult thing to find, that's happy to play and goes like, yeah, no. Or says yes, like whichever way it is, someone who's not enculturated into the organisation, I think is the other piece, right? Because even if you've built those cultures around challenging and asking questions and all of that, they're still enculturated into the organisation. Someone who's not part of it, who walks in, who doesn't have any meaningful allegiances to any of the internal big organisations, have their own politics and all of those kinds of things, who just comes in and goes like, yeah, nah, right? Because I don't care whose fiefdom I'm eviscerating right now, I'm just going to say that that's not going to work. So to me, they're the two ways. Either you do it really, really well culturally or you get in externals, I think.
I'm just wondering that Hamas was popularly elected by the people of Gaza. How do they maintain, or do they still maintain support from the people of Gaza in seeing that they have been used as political as a political fodder, basically, for the cause?
There's been the last polling numbers that I saw had small upticks in the West Bank and in Gaza in support of Hamas and in support of October 7th and the sacrifices and everything else. One of the really important parts, I think, in assessing anything to do with Gaza or the West Bank and this circles back to a point that I didn't make earlier, right? We didn't see hundreds of thousands of people protesting in support of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, right? Part of the reason for that is because, generally speaking, the underlying grievance that they have, the political grievance that they have, isn't broadly recognised as legitimate. The political grievance that sits underneath an organisation like Hamas is not entirely made up, right? I don't have any kind of answer about what it is that should be done to resolve the population of Gaza and the West Bank vis-a-vis Israel. But if you've been, like, it's not great, right? Gaza is probably one of the worst prior to October 7 places in the world. And as a result, I'll use an example from two different problem sets. There's parts of the Australian government that do sentiment analysis. And they do sentiment analysis in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. And I'll use arbitrary figures here. But generally speaking, in the aftermath of a jihadist terrorist attack, a stabbing by a guy who says ISIS out loud on a camera somewhere, small sort of 10% of the population says, I don't agree with what he did, but I support the reasons that he did it for. In the Australian context, you jump to something like 20 to 30% of support and sympathy, not for what they do, but for the reasons when you get into a right-wing space. Right? So something like Christchurch, plenty of people who support the ideas don't support shooting 51 people in a mosque. On Palestine, there's loads of elected officials all over the Western world who support the idea of the liberation of Palestine, and that what happened on October 7th was merely a sacrifice in the pursuit of that cause. For the populations of Palestine, that sacrifice was minuscule when you stack it up against what's happened since 1948. Now, that's not my view, but there is very much, I think it's reasonable to say, within the Palestinian population, a belief that sacrifice in pursuit of their strategic end state, whether that's Hamas's version of the entirety of Israel no longer existing and it just being Palestine, or whether it's a two-state solution, whichever one in between it happens to be, that these are small sacrifices that we have to make in the name of national liberation. And if we take the layer of the deep controversy that sits around Israel-Palestine generally away for a second and just sort of stack it up against other wars of national liberation, lots of people dying in a national war of liberation is sort of part of how that plays out. It's pretty standard. And so I think it's important on this and on anything that we don't end up mirroring our own sensibilities onto assessing how the local population thinks about things. They're like, oh, well, I wouldn't die for that. They will. Otherwise, the vast majority of the population of Gaza or of the West Bank would have fled to Jordan or Egypt well before October 7 and just gone like, no, this isn't worth the struggle. Except if you believe that this is your both national homeland and religiously ordained homeland, then what you're prepared to endure and sacrifice changes entirely, right? So, yeah, like I said at the start, I think there's some early numbers that suggested that support was increasing. I don't think the broad sentiment across the rest of the region has shifted much from what it's always been, which is governments seeing it as a politically convenient tool, but none of the governments of the Middle East have ever undertaken any significant sacrifice on behalf of the Palestinian population. They've only ever fought out of national interest or what they perceive to be strategic interests, and they aren't going to over this one either. Right? The Egyptians didn't open the border, right? And they did that because they looked at Jordan, where a third of the population is Palestinian, and went like, no, we don't want that. Right? So yeah, I think it's, yeah, I remember teaching similar stuff around jihadism and suicide operations, right? Like, why would you? Well, because you're prepared to sacrifice, right? Like being prepared to endure in the name of a cause that you hold genuinely deeply is sort of one of the ways in which an otherwise weak actor suddenly gets an enormous body of strength and capability behind it, is that they're prepared to die. I think it's Hamas is where the line comes from. Is it? We love death as you love life. Yeah. That if you're and without getting into a whole thing about terrorism in the abstract, a terrorist organisation that has transcendental objectives, as in what it seeks is religiously orientated, I can't give you that, right? If what you want is just a national homeland, then that's a thing that we can actually negotiate. If you want a power sharing arrangement, we can negotiate that. I can release hostages. But if what you want is paradise in the apocalypse, I don't have any tools as a nation state to do any kind of meaningful negotiation with you. And Hamas sort of straddles both of those. They want a national homeland, but they also want that as part of a broader quasi-jihadist agenda. So there's a ceiling on what you can actually achieve with them, and that's one of their points of leverage, if I've kind of answered your question, I think.
I'd also make the point that dropping bombs on people, even people in the West, say the UK or Germany, or that, doesn't tend to make them give up.
No.
It makes them fight harder.
Yeah.
And that's you can't get the numbers for it, but that tends to be what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the corollary of that is that getting an adversary who seeks the afterlife to capitulate to your will is a really fundamental dilemma. Talking to law enforcement audiences used to talk about how like we can help you with the paradise bit. That's we're very good at that, but that literally feeds your narrative of how you recruit people into your cause, is because we keep doing this thing to you and we say, no, we don't, and then we do. And they make claims that we keep doing the thing. And that's kind of the wedge that Israel finds itself in now, right? It still feels like it has to do what it's doing, even though it's fundamentally, I would argue, strategically counterproductive, and well past the point of counterproductive. That almost to the stage where the existential threat is as much ongoing Israeli decision-making as it is anything to do with Hamas. So.
All right, any other questions from the floor? Well, please put your hands together for Dr. Levi West.
Thank you.